Kyle, the one coming up is great. Admiral Pat Walsh, 4-star admiral, illustrious career in the Navy, the only individual that was ever a Blue Angel and rose to 4-star, one of the most insightful, knowledgeable, intellectual people that I've ever been around.
When the discussion spans servant leadership, it spans topics for the everyday businesswoman or businessman, and expands ultimately into his role helping the U.S. Navy around the world. Really insightful, really impactful.
This is one not to miss.
Welcome to Intersections, where we take a multi-generational look at the critical issues facing America. Tom, we got our guest in the studio.
Kyle, I'll tell you, I'm really excited about this one. Pat is a good friend, but more important than that, probably one of the best examples I know of someone that not only has been committed to his country, but committed to individuals and the servant leadership that we've talked about. Pat has had roles in the Navy that range from naval aviator to the Blue Angels, Fifth Fleet, strategy at the Pentagon, number 2 in the Navy as the Vice Chief of Naval Ops, and then the Commander of the Pacific Fleet. So probably one of the most illustrious careers that you'll ever find in the Navy. Pat, of all those assignments that you've had, what do you look back on as the most satisfying of all of those assignments?
So you didn't say fun.
We'll get to fun in just a second.
Satisfying command at any level. So I didn't think you could do any better than command of an F-18 squadron, which was remarkable in so many respects, because you get to know people really, really well. So it's about 200 people, 12 airplanes, and deploy on aircraft carriers. So the F-18 is a single-seat fighter. It's a strike fighter, so it can function as an air-to-air capability or an air-to-ground capability. It's a way of advancing U.S. national security interest anywhere, anytime around the world. All we need is water to get there and air to fly, and we're good to go.
Contrast that with Commander of the Pacific Fleet. And I've been out with Commanders of the Pacific Fleet. So when they go on to ships, they don't just say Admiral Walsh or Commander. They say, now on board the Pacific Fleet.
Yeah, I mean, a very heady experience, because of all the lineage that preceded us. So one of the interesting aspects of the job is that there's an element of history that's critically important to understand the context of the role that we're playing. But there's also a critical element of keeping pace with today's environment, much like the theme that we're talking about here for Intersections. So we live in that world all the time where we can become imprisoned and held back by history and the bias that accompanies some of those themes throughout history, particularly in the Pacific, where there's many that have simply not forgotten the atrocities associated with World War. But at the same time, keeping pace with an environment that is very dynamic and constantly changing. So the level of satisfaction that goes with a position like that just needs to be redefined in different terms. I think the challenge that people have that are forward deployed and operational is trying to relay now how quickly the environment is changing, and to do it in a way that is meaningful and impactful for an audience in Washington that is typically preoccupied with the crisis of the moment. To be able to think long-term, that's a different challenge. What that means is that those who occupy these positions of leadership in an operational role have to find a way to communicate in a way that threads the needle between past and present, and is not simply a way to maneuver and achieve more resources, which is, unfortunately, that's typically how the bottom line is represented in Washington. But at the same time, is impactful because we understand the consequences of getting it wrong.
So rising to be a 4-star admiral. So what was the most fun assignment?
Well, just for context for the audience, my dad was a coach. And admirals were really interesting to study. Coaches were gods in high school. So I come from an environment as the oldest of 6 where, rising in the Navy was not something that was really first and foremost in my mind. It happened to work out that way. And I give credit beginning with the all-volunteer force, recognizing that investments had to be made in people in order to be able to put choice in the center of the national security debate. So think about it. We're over 50 years now with the all-volunteer force. Milton Friedman first proposed this idea as a white paper that goes to the early stages of the Nixon administration, but really made the case that you had to make material investment in people because you were going to have to compete for their time, their attention, and for their choice to make this a career. So we went from conscripts in some professional forces, standing forces, to where we are today, where we're a global force for good in the minds of some. And to be able to do that required a tremendous amount of investment in people. I'm the beneficiary of that. And so one of the reasons why I stayed is because I could grow. And the White House Fellowship Program is a great example of that, where we take kind of a detour in this very linear career path and broaden ourselves and then come back and go back to the business of operations. But learning how to balance a broader perspective and a very narrow tactical perspective and when to do that, that to me is the value that goes with the investments for those who wear uniforms today.
Is the all-volunteer force as effective today, given changes in generations?
Yeah, and the current debate can really obscure, I think, the merits of what people bring to the all-volunteer force. We tend to get captured by some of the jargon and jingo that goes with kind of the current themes that are very controversial. I tend to look past that simply because I joined in 1973 at a time when the country was reeling from real conflict. I mean, you know, people had been hurt on campus that were protesting. There were protests all up and down Washington. And it was really hard to find true commitment to the country because the country was turning on itself. Yet we found a way to get through all that. And I don't think that's because of a political leader. I think we as a people decided, we're better than this. And we've learned how to think through, some of the challenges that go with being in the armed forces and separating that from the people who actually serve. This Memorial Day weekend is a really good time to remind ourselves of that.
Yeah. Good lessons. We'll come back to it.
So let's take a look into your personal life. You've obviously got an illustrious resume.
I don't know where this is going to
go. Only good areas. Yeah. So aviation. How'd you get into being an aviator? Tell us that story.
When I went to Annapolis, the program at Annapolis, Professional Development Program, gives us exposure to life on a ship, life on a submarine, being with Marines, being with aviators. I was 18, 19 years old. It was cool to be around aviators. Have any other questions?
Well, but
aviation was fun. It was very fulfilling. What drew me to it was the scholar-athlete model. Mm-hmm. So particularly in the fighter community, there's an element of physical fitness that was required in order to be able to, put the airplane on, strap it on, and go out and do the nation's business. And at the same time, we're by ourselves, meaning we had to think through system of systems and find a way to make sure the number of takeoffs equal the number of landings. And there's no one else to turn to when you're a single seat naval aviator.
But naval aviator and being a jet pilot, the Top Gun. Yeah. How did that happen?
By accident. So what Tom's getting at is in the progression of learning how to fly, we get to a point where there's an intersection in the road after about 50 hours of flight time. And that's when we put in our preferences for what we want to fly and what we want to do in naval aviation. So the choices are jets, propeller-driven airplane, or helicopter. Those are the communities. And based on the needs of the Navy, there's a floating grade point average that either goes up, meaning that we don't need any more in this community, or it goes down and we'll take anyone who's breathing. Okay. We are flying equipment that was made by the lowest bidder, but your audience already knows that. So in my particular case, I came through with a cohort of about 15 people in the summer of 1977. And we are matriculating through the program together. They're all aerospace engineers. These are people that some of them have prior flying experience. And we are getting to that intersection together until I couldn't stay on the flight schedule because I had to have my tonsils taken out.
Oh my God.
So when we have a medical procedure like that, we step aside, everybody else goes through, and then I'll just kind of pick up with the next cohort behind me. When everybody goes through, nobody gets what they wanted to fly. They wanted F-14s or the space shuttle, nothing less, and none of them were able to get what they wanted.
Of the 14 that went with you.
Yeah. So I come through the following week and a half later or so, and the instructor, Jim Alexander, says, "Hey, do you want to fly jets?" And I go, "Oh, yeah, I really want to fly jets." And by some miracle, I have this amazing grade point average at the end of that flight, which then pushes me over the threshold by 1,000th of a point, and I got to fly jets.
Wow.
And so it's one of those good humility reminders that in the course of time, I would sort of come up and introduce myself to other aviators out there, and they would almost either complain or apologize for the community they were in. It's like, you don't have to do that. I understand how this works more than most. So I considered myself lucky then, and the luck continued. So
it's a blessing.
It is.
It's a real blessing.
And then Top Gun, and then the Blue Angels.
So we worked with Top Gun and helped develop the curriculum for Top Gun. I was at Air Test and Evaluation Squadron 5, and which is out in the desert, in the Mojave Desert, not far from Edwards Air Force Base. And I was doing operational test on the F-18. Had the prerequisite amount of flight time, which is about 7 or 8 years of flying, to apply for the Blue Angels. Flew with the Blue Angels for 3 years. 2 of those were in the A4, and then in the 3rd year, my job was to transition to the team to the airplane I used to fly, the F-18. So little did we know in 1986, in November of 1986, when the first F-18 showed up that's painted blue, that they're going to be flying F-18s until 2025 or much longer.
So I want to get into some fun stuff. What was it like? Obviously, you've traveled the world. You lived all over the world. What was it like experiencing different cultures, seeing different parts of the world that the United States was involved in, and learning how to kind of juxtapose where you grew up, what you knew, with serving America's interest abroad in cultures that maybe were welcoming to America, but also probably many that were not?
Yeah, hugely interesting, because the first thing that comes to mind is you get a chance to see so much of what you studied come to life. And in retrospect, looking back on what I studied, I realized my focus and the takeaways that I had from being in school were not in alignment with what I was learning as I was experiencing the world that you described. The best example for me was to live in the Middle East. So I'm on the economy, local economy, in command of 5th Fleet in Bahrain, where Bahrain is surrounded by a Shia village, yet the ruling minority are Sunni in a population that is majority Shia. And here I am, an Irishman, where all of us use, the same dermatologist, and except, I'm in a class by my own there, and I find out what it's like to live in the minority. So think about that. You're in the majority. You don't think twice about it.
And what years was this?
2005 to 7.
Okay, so this is full war on terror.
Full war on terror.
Way in the game.
The Sunni uprising had blown up the Shia mosque in Iraq, and so we had descended at that point into a full-blown uprising taking place in Iraq that was complicating all the objectives that we had. But back to sort of understanding what it means to move from a position where you never really think about yourself or how you're thinking or how you're expressing yourself into an environment where you're no longer in the majority. And all of those nonverbal cues, all of that, the way you assimilate information and sort of assess where you are, all of that now changes. That calculation, that personal calculation changes. And you're always sort of waiting for, okay, what is it that's going to happen next? There's a certain edge, even though I've never heard anyone describe it that way, but in reflection, where you never are really confident of who you're with or what they're saying, because it's a language you don't understand. These are people that just simply have not had the same life experience you have. And it was at that point where, the big life lesson and light came on going, I think I understand now in different terms, an appreciation for the majority, minority, whether that's in race or in religion or in some other aspect, economic disparity. I mean, it all comes down to who's in the majority, what positive obligations they have to the minority, and then what it's like to feel like in the minority. And in the absence of someone that's sort of reaching out, opening a door for you, the reluctance that you have inside of going, hey, I've been hurt, I've been burned before, I don't want to put my family through that. I mean, all of those things now really come to life in a way that I'd never studied in a book, and yet had a chance to appreciate it myself.
Yeah, real world experience. Hard to academically know it.
You used the analogy earlier of sports teams, and clearly in corporate environments, we talk about the importance of teams and those sorts of things. But I can't think of a team where the stakes are as high as they are in the Blue Angels, when you're literally flying less than a foot away at speeds that are only unimaginable. What did you learn about teams, and how did that change your thinking later on in your career with assignments that have enormous implications for not only the Navy, but our country's security?
So for the audience, there's 6 pilots, and out of the 6, 3 are brand new every year. So the biggest compliment you can give to somebody on the team is, hey, it looks the same as last year. Well, the same as last year is a big hurdle, big step function in terms of both personal as well as team performance. So the way this starts is there's typically 25 to 30 or so that apply for a position or two. The team picks its own replacements largely because we have to address the question you just asked, which is we have to be willing to accept criticism. So that's the key to chemistry, so that the 3 that are brand new are being debriefed each time we fly by the people who have done it before. Every maneuver, starting with when we walk to the airplanes and get 6 people to walk in step together, is all filmed. And we'll go frame by frame looking for our own mistakes with a clear understanding that we'll never be satisfied with what we're doing. And the way we depersonalize this is the airplane's out of position, or the steps that we took are out of position, or the language that we used was either inappropriate or created confusion. But the idea is that we're always surrendering ourselves to critique. And when you do that, as an individual, the sky's the limit. If you can do that as a team, then you can sustain high performance. If you can't do that, it becomes very brittle. Emotionally, it becomes brittle. You don't have the resilience that you need in order to be able to debrief small things. If you really focus on the small things, then the big things don't pop up. So airplanes start as a flight of 2, typically 25 to 30 feet apart, and that's in November. The base altitude, we won't go any lower, is 2,000 feet. So when we perform maneuvers, we're adding 2,000 feet to what the published maneuver would be if we were doing a show performance. So if the base altitude during a show is 200 feet, when we start, it's 2,200 feet. And then we will critique ourselves to the point where it has to be exactly 2,200 feet. And then we're ready to step down and come down 500 feet. But the airplanes are now moving closer and closer together. So we start as a flight of 2. After 150 flights, it's a flight of 6. And the closest we fly is right about there, 24 to 36 inches. And in the case of flying in the left wing, in the signature maneuver, which is the plan form of the 4 airplanes in the diamond formation. We move up the bearing line, a 3-dimensional bearing line, to the point where I can hear a change in the engine. When I hear a change in the pitch of the boss or the lead engine, that's this distance, whatever that is today, and hold that for, 45 seconds or so.
The sensing of it. The interesting thing you brought up was that ability to take criticism. Because I think in a lot of cases today, and in corporate environments too, people either shy away from getting criticism, or if they do get criticism, it's taken as personal. But you and I had once had a conversation that as we look back on World War II, arguably one of the lowest days in naval history, December 7th, and you're akin to this having lived in the Nimitz House as commander of the Pacific Fleet. One of the arguments that people have used why the United States was so successful only 8 months later in Midway was we were able to look at the faults, the mistakes that we made, and address those while the Japanese were not able to. They kind of avoided that kind of conflict, which really made a difference potentially for the change of the war.
Naval Japanese Captain Fuchida described what you just said as victory disease, because they had this long march and they hadn't really been hit hard. And he too looked back and said there were signs that we should have never gotten ourselves into where we were on Midway, which is in June of 42, first week of June of 42. Interesting. I went to the USS Midway in order to commemorate the Battle of Midway. So for context here, USS Midway keel laid 18 months later in October of 1945. It is ready to go to sea. And the person who is christening the ship, so that's the bottle of champagne that goes over the bow, Earl Gay, Torpedo Squadron 8 sole survivor who watched the Battle of Midway from the Pacific Ocean because he'd been shot down. And Barbara Ripley. So Barbara Ripley is a young widow. Secretary of the Navy asked the Navy to have her as a sponsor for Midway. And turns out that her brother joined the Navy at the age of 39, went to flight school, fought in the war, came back, and started the family business. And in 1966, that was known as Cox Communications. So Barbara Cox Ripley outlived the life of USS Midway and survived in Hawaii all those years. But while I was at the Midway, the survivors of the Battle of Midway from Japan came into my office. And Nimitz has this caricature, which is a timeline of what blue forces, U.S. forces, and red forces, Japanese forces, were doing according to the intelligence that he had. And so they were trying to understand what happened. So even today, they were perplexed, like, why did we go swimming that day? Because we didn't understand what happened and how all of our carriers were lost.
Wow.
When you were commander of the Pacific Fleet, I think I've had some tough assignments and tough tasks that were given to me. We think of a position like that in the Navy as dealing simply with attack, defense, et cetera, those sorts of things. But when you were a commander of the Pacific Fleet, you were given a task that I have a difficult time even thinking of putting my arms around. Can you talk about the assignment of that, what your initial reaction is? Of course, what it is.
Yeah.
And then how do you approach something that's that big?
So we're talking about March 11th, 2011. And in the Japanese perspective, their 311 is the equivalent to our 9/11 in terms of the destructiveness of what took place that day. Because Japan is the most instrumented country in the world, we know exactly where and when what happened. So at 2:46 p.m. Japan time, 65 miles off the coast of Sendai, the Eurasian plate and Pacific plate had been pushing up against each other for hundreds of years. And for reasons we don't know why, released all that energy into a 9.1 magnitude earthquake. Anything over an 8.3 is a 1,000-year event. We're looking at seismograph data in Honolulu, assuming that there's a problem with the technology, because a 9.1 magnitude earthquake actually affects the tilt of the Earth's axis. It wobbles. It physically moved Japan 7 feet. It dropped the coastline by more than a meter. It created a wave that went up to 133 feet, and that moved at the speed of a jet into Sendai. It reaches 6.5 miles inland, and it's like an egg beater. It sort of pulls everything back out to sea. 400,000 homes and businesses destroyed, 20,000 lives lost. And the image that you get is a super tanker that's on top of buildings, and trains and subways sort of pulled out to sea with homes. It was something that the carnage level is something that no one ever anticipated or expected. The initial reaction, I think, is a telling sort of statement, which is we needed the best solutions the world could offer. So in typical sort of organizational management, we start with a very vertically oriented command and control sort of mindset, which is to say that we start with authorities and then resources and senior and subordinate relationships. And it was very clear that a traditional approach just simply wasn't going to work. What we needed was to reorient our own axis to a much more horizontal approach, meaning we needed unity of purpose rather than unity of command. We needed transparency across all the NGOs. There were 49 international non-governmental organizations, all the ministries in Japan to include TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company. And with that, an understanding that we're all going to get the good news and the bad news at the same time. So there was no U.S.-only kind of relationship. I had the benefit of graduate work at Fletcher, and the area that I was most intrigued by was coalitions, simply because I had come out of the first Gulf War, and we had this international coalition in a way I'd never been exposed to before. Yet it gave us primacy, it gave us moral authority to do what needed to be done to finish our business and leave, and to do so in a way that was sustainable as far as the relationships are concerned. This idea of having improbable relationships and making them routinely possible is a theme that carries with me, because as we're in Japan, we realize if we don't figure this out with the loss of primary, secondary, and tertiary power to Fukushima power plant, we're going to have to evacuate Japan. And sure enough, yeah. So we have
it's not what do we do? It's evacuate an entire island of 40 million people,
and we've got more than 200,000 Americans there. So that's our focus, and people are craving information. And what happens, of course, with the loss of the ability to circulate cool, fresh water is now chemical reactions in building 1, 2, and 3. So there's 6 reactors lined up parallel to the coastline. When the architects of this idea came up with this, what they thought was access to water, what they didn't contemplate is the actual loss of the coastline. So when the coastline drops by more than a meter, it changes all the wave dynamic in a way that now makes Fukushima very vulnerable. With the loss of building 1, 2, and 3 and chemical reactions because of meltdowns, and now the explosion of radioactivity into the atmosphere, which then tracks by vehicles around the country, gets into the food supply, gets into the water supply. People are asking the question, should we stay or should we leave? Well, in order to leave, they would have to queue up outside. And that would put them in direct exposure to cesium, iodine, and other radioactive elements that were present and yet not visible. So the answer became accelerating the pivot into social media in a way that we just simply hadn't thought of before. Social media, Facebook, was keeping up with like moment-to-moment communications in ways that traditional communication models were simply leaving people in the dust. And their question was, what do I do? And in order to create trust, what we did is we went to all the radiation detection elements that are in Japan anyway, tying them together, which was already done. It's not like we had to come up with this idea, but giving people exposure so that they could see it for themselves. What they were going to see was background radiation versus spikes in radiation that was manageable versus radiation that was lethal. And there was so many different types that it was important to share that information real time and then help people make their own decision. And the decision that ultimately came out was that the lethal radiation was, I don't want to say it was under control, but was not an immediate threat. We had sensor packages all around Fukushima so that if it was a threat, we would have a way of notifying everyone. In the meantime, take shelter, stay inside until we get a chance to really get this to subside.
And how long did this take to figure out, the plan, but then to go execute some of this?
There wasn't just one earthquake. There were 1,500 aftershocks, averaging 7.0. So simply trying to manage this while there was another earthquake got to be really emotionally very difficult and traumatic. But we were there for many, many weeks afterwards. So the interesting leadership sort of question here is that I didn't realize it, but I was going to be out in front of the Japanese media, and there's a real benefit to not being prepared for anything here because it forces you to be like completely candid and completely honest, and so there's a lot of specific questions on like what are you going to do, and I didn't know what we were going to do other than we were going to stay, and just we're going to be here with you until we get through this together. And that
was
the
most important thing you could say.
That was the answer. I didn't know that was the answer, but for those of you who are in positions where people are genuinely concerned about their security and safety, to give them reassurances that you're going to be there is, I think, the better answer than, we're going to have this appropriated and we've got this authorized and now we're going to send you this money. They're not interested in that at all. They're trying to get through tonight and tomorrow.
And that's really when you think about the history of our country, where we've been. I mean, we have been the one player in the world that's been there when others needed it and built the allies and the position that's necessary, again, to suit our leadership, but also to benefit the world. Given that, Pat, what's your thought today on an administration that has said in a lot of ways that's not important and we're going to push back, that those allies, those relationships, those coalitions are not important anymore?
So let's go to the root of it. Just as a footnote to the last conversation, Japan Times published just last year a recap of where we are today compared to where we were then. The Japanese-U.S. relationship has advanced in so many ways, not just because of the Mutual Defense Pact, but because we took risk on behalf of our friends in Japan. They recognize that, and they credit Operation Tomodachi, which is Operation Friend, as really a launching point to think of a relationship that's very different than what it used to be. One that we're actually have a compatible vision of the future together in ways that we simply couldn't talk about. We would get bogged down in transactional sorts of debates over the future of U.S. presence in Japan. There were many in Japan that just couldn't see the value of it, that it was a bill that Japan was paying, and that they didn't see, if you just kind of reverse this logic, they didn't see what was in it for them. In fact, it was provocative that we were there. And there was changes in government in Japan in time where they wanted more of an opening with China in ways that we were preventing. Well, once we demonstrate that we're willing to take risks for them, our friends, then the relationship just gets recharacterized in so many different ways. But the root issue of where we are today, I think, is important to discuss because if you just jump to the conclusion, it's exactly the way you summarized it. But if you're trying to anticipate like where the administration is going to go, I think you have to unpack what we learned in 2024 in ways that really start with what will referred to as the rules-based system. So what is the rules-based system? It was derided, it was mocked in the run-up to the election, and people just didn't see the value of it. The rules-based system is this series of defense agreements designed coming out of World War II for a deterrence posture that would then allow the freedom of movement in economies, particularly in the Pacific, that would allow for, with that freedom of movement, real commerce, and with that commerce now a reduction in trade barriers and opportunities to lift an entire generation out of poverty. So if you look at pictures of post-World War Japan and Tokyo and Singapore and compare that where we are today, it's dramatically different. The rules-based system actually worked as advertised. But what it also did was, in the reduction of trade barriers, it moved low-cost production centers offshore. I don't know that we adjusted to that. And what that does is it creates in the minds of some that we have two Americas, one that benefited from it and the others that were left behind by it. That group now gets a very loud voice, and it starts to look like these quote-unquote forever wars were always for someone else's benefit and not for us. How did we benefit from it? So when you're looking at the next steps the administration is taking, I would keep that sort of in the back of my mind, that people felt abandoned by all the investment of like personal treasure that went into this system that helped make the world a better place, except, there's pockets around the country that just didn't feel like they benefited from it. I live in the world of education today, and I see two different Americas in terms of those who benefit from going to college and those who never attend. I mean, statistically, people are twice as likely to live in to be unemployed, and 4 times as likely to live in poverty if they don't go to college and complete college.
Well, and we've seen, if you look at the middle class over the last 40 years or so, wages of middle class have fundamentally, on a real basis, been flat. They haven't moved at all, to reinforce the point that you've taken. While unfortunately, the upper, pick your number, 1, 5, 10%, that, especially in a zero rate environment, those asset holders have progressed and prospered inordinately.
So here's the summary point to the question, which is before we withdraw, let's recognize what we've invested. I mean, there's sunk costs that went into creating this system now that benefits so many, where we have a leadership position. You can't buy a leadership position. That comes with credibility. That comes with sacrifice. It comes with real leadership.
Trust.
Yeah. And so that means that people want to emulate you. And if you're going to withdraw, if you're going to step back from that role, unfortunately, there's too many in the world that want to fill that spot.
So before we get into your time at Christo Rey and some of the other personal items, I want to talk about 2 hotspots around the world, the Strait of Hormuz and the South China Sea. Obviously, these are flashpoints globally for many reasons. Would love to just get your take on where you see both regions as they are today and the things and the issues that are taking place, and how can America reverse, as we just previously talked about, or how do we step in and create a new situation?
Or how do we get to where we are today? If you start with the Straits of Hormuz, for example, one of the challenges, particularly when we were there, was recognizing that the leadership in Iran at the time, Ahmadinejad, wanted to turn the Gulf into a burning hell, and when he did that, he actually opened more doors for us than he closed, because all we had to do was to come back and say, we can put together a coalition of friendly navies that will now participate in how we're going to clear mines out of the Gulf. And let's start the exercise, since it sounds like it's coming soon. And so we had partnerships in ways that we never could have anticipated, largely because of the language that was coming out of the leadership in Iran. There was a time when we didn't understand internal Iranian politics very well, as we looked at demographic data inside of Iran and polling data inside of Iran, what we found is a very large country that was largely Western-oriented, believed in a pluralistic system, pluralistic society, but that there was a top level of IRGCN, so this is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, that had a real tight grip on the population, and the mullahs that were exerting their very authoritative regime, cracking down on any sort of dissent in a way that it became clear to us that whatever national policy that we took, that we never wanted to alienate those who were more aligned with us, and to get them to be able to think on their feet. There was a point in time, and you'll remember this, with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, where the debate in our country was, is it in our national interest to be in Yugoslavia? And then that became Kosovo and the wars that followed. There are many who remember that one of the reasons we got to Al-Qaeda on 9/11 was because we had these long-standing permanent bases in the Middle East as a result of the 1991 war, and that we had never fully gone home. And it fueled those who were trying to get the United States to retreat. The reason I bring it up in the context of the Straits of Hormuz or in the South China Sea, but particularly in the Straits of Hormuz, there used to be a way of thinking that, it's their issue, they need to deal with it. And Yemen is a great example. So we would look at very strong authoritative leaders in Yemen, and we'd go, that's their issue, let them take care of it. And now we find out, through Iranian proxies with the Houthis, that, they can disrupt international commerce in ways that are very expensive and very deadly. And so my point is, in a globalized world where so many weapons are proliferated, I worry about trying to assume we can take an isolationist posture, like we've done in the interwar year period between World War I and World War II, and assume that we're going to be able to walk away from that unscathed, that it's someone else's issue, that the oceans protect us. It's just not the world that we live in today. In the South China Sea, we can go to that if you like.
Sure.
Yeah. So in the 2008-2009 timeframe, the Convention on the International Law of the Sea had a requirement for nations to submit their request for undersea resources. In other words, the extended continental shelf was now up for debate amongst the signatories of the Law of the Sea Convention, meaning that if you want to mine offshore on your shelf, and these delimitations were all part of the Law of Sea proceedings, then you need to make those submissions. And what we find is that countries such as Singapore and Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines all make their submissions. And at that point in time, that's when China comes in with what's called the 9-dash line. And that is a line that extends 1,600 nautical miles off the southern coastline of China into the Straits of Malacca that says, this is ours. And with that, because it's ours, it's subject to internal Chinese law, meaning all you have to do is ask for permission, and then you'll be granted permission, and you can use the South China Sea. That was the perspective that China was taking. And all the language started to now accelerate to the point where there was generating real friction. During that time frame, there were bumper cars going on back and forth between Chinese Coast Guard and Filipino, Japanese, as well as some of the U.S. surveillance ships. And then Xi Jinping comes into power and now makes a declaration that he's going to have this job for life. And now he becomes even more authoritarian. And so whatever hide, their capability and bide their time, which had been the Chinese sort of proverb of how they were going to present themselves on the international world stage, all of that gets set aside. And now we see an acceleration of China asserting itself in ways we hadn't seen before. So the Olympics had gone very well in 2008. The world was in a recession while China had 2.7 in foreign currency, 2.7 trillion in foreign currency reserve. And so they're starting to feel like, this is our time. And since that time, we have been in an escalatory sort of match at sea and in the air, and to a degree on the ground in certain boundaries and territories in ways that I really worry about miscalculation in this environment that we're in today.
And let's push that a little bit further. One of your successors several years ago predicted that by the end of 2030, China would invade Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Clearly, there's a lot of military action around that island today. By all indications, Xi has put it as a very high priority in his kind of list of things to do before he leaves, of reuniting Taiwan with mainland China. How do you look at that situation? How difficult is that going to be, and how much of a threat is that going to be as a potential conflict between the United States and China militarily?
Yeah, I think it's a very real threat. It's the sort of thing that we've been trying to manage and deal with for a very long time. I mean, this is where the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 comes from, was the recognition that if we're going to now formally recognize Beijing and we're going to downgrade our relationship with Taipei, that there needs to be some sort of tie. I mean, the legislatures recognize that, and I think the lawmakers were right for doing that. But what that means is in the context of today's environment, you can look at it as an amphibious landing that we're most concerned about. And when Admiral Phil Davidson first talked about it, his primary concern was that Xi Jinping had actually staked his personal reputation on the reunification. And that's where these timelines come from, is that people are sort of looking at, okay,
70 years old today,
since
10 years.
Since he's made this projection and he's now attached himself to the reunification. What does that actually look like, and what is that timeline? The area that I think offers the most promise is one that's actually playing out today, and that's in cyber. I think cyber offers the opportunity for the United States to play as overt or covert a role they want to play in the region. Because I will go back to this phrase, China has opened more doors than they've closed, and we should recognize it that way. So we have opportunities for partnerships with Japan, with South Korea, with countries, the ASEAN countries in particular, who see China and they're trying to hedge their bets. Cyber is a way to approach the problem as a potential solution because it applies to the private sector. We're not just segmented into military to military conflict. This is something, this kind of escalation and conflict affects everyone in terms of quality of life and economies for respective countries. You could have those partnerships in cyber today, and you could be very defensive oriented in terms of looking out for the economies and the teams from respective units.
You've spun that a little differently, though. Another military leader, Wesley Clark, would actually say the cyber is a real issue for us. And Pat, by all measures, you're an expert in cyber, having been involved in it in a number of different ways post-retirement from the Navy. He would look at it and say, that's the problem because China, over the course of the last couple of decades, has infused into our technologies, be it grids, be it water systems, whatever it may be, the potential to deal enormous damage to our economy, both in terms of dollars and in terms of lives. In your view, how much of a threat is that China can use the cyber as an offensive weapon and a compelling offensive weapon against us? And related to that, how strong are we to be able to utilize cyber as a defense or an offensive measure, as you indicated a moment ago?
Yeah. So remember that in the case of cyber, they don't follow Augustinian law when it comes to proportionality or innocence. So there can be a problem between Taipei and Beijing and it affects the ATM machine or the water supply. because the points you're making are very valid. Yes, there's been intrusion, Chinese intrusion, into a number of these infrastructure and installations that we absolutely rely on. So being aware of it is like problem number one. So when we were in the Pacific, specifically focused on cyber, now this is a commercial entity, trying to convince governments in the Pacific that they'd been had, that there were cyber espionage actors in their networks for more than 5 years was like news to them, and not news that they were actually excited to embrace, especially publicly. So we have that kind of challenge. My point in raising it as a partnership is one that you can be very clear with the messaging that once you've tried to attack someone, that sort of attack works once, because now the game plan is out. Everybody can see it. And this is one of the reasons after the Sony hack that the private sector wanted to hack back, because they couldn't figure out where the U.S. government was. When it came to cyber insurance, for example, state actors weren't contemplated with cyber insurance. So how do you, if you're Sony, how do you now present that, that liability, and who's going to pay for that? That was North Korean system that actually melted servers. I mean, in terms of the real damage that was done. I think raising the game here on cyber is one that we just have not fully tapped into these systems and people and talent in ways that we ought to. What I mean by that is you don't need a traditional sort of brick and mortar approach when it comes to cyber. You have a chance to re-architect something that's very different, a very flat organization that taps into capability, whether people can pass a personal fitness test and put a uniform on and you check their teeth, and 5 years later, maybe they can make a contribution. You don't have to do that. You can do something very, very different with cyber in ways that tap into the real capability that's in the private sector. I think it's a public-private partnership, and it starts here at home, and it's the sort of thing that can expand quite well. One of the into the international arena. One of the things that was especially helpful in the case of China sort of asserting itself on the world stage was actually letting their leaders hear back from us directly. So I'm at a maritime symposium in Australia, and Taiwan is present. The Taiwan Navy is present, and the Wu Shengli, the Chinese naval leader, is present as well. So the Taiwan representative stands up and says, "We would like to participate in humanitarian operations at sea." And Wu Shengli stands up and says, "You're Chinese, and you should do what Chinese tell you to do." And the room goes silent. You got a couple of hundred people there. He was preceded by the Chinese delegate who was talking about their humanitarian operations and piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden. And he apologized that his English was so poor, but that we would all be speaking Mandarin soon. So room goes silent. And when I got to Wu Shengli, I said, you guys ought to get out more often. It's really important for people to hear from you. And because, this scares people when they hear this stuff, and they're not reading about it in a third-party sort of source or newspaper. They're hearing it firsthand, and they're going, this is what they're really talking about.
Okay. So to push you, how vulnerable are we to the Chinese on the cyber front?
We're very vulnerable. If we're vulnerable to weather, as we're here in Texas, then that tells you that we just haven't invested in infrastructure the way we need to. So what does it take to invest? You've been on the government side of this thing. Unless you're responding to a crisis, the idea of having a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan to improve infrastructure, and then with that, to build it for security rather than just simply access. That's the problem. A device that we create today is intended to plug in. And then it moves from being a phone to being an iPhone, and then a device that can actually, control lots of stuff. Well, with that, intersection becomes now all kinds of vulnerability for security, because security is like, a backwards technology. We forgot about that. We didn't realize that backdoor. We didn't think of that vulnerability. And now we got to engineer security into something that's already been out and proliferated. I think we have to just think differently about it.
We've got to get to the education that Kyle talked about, but kind of the last piece on the China side. Biden in 2022 did something that no American president has ever done. Moved away from what we've called strategic ambiguity of not addressing specifically what our reaction would be to a Taiwanese situation, and actually came out and said, yes, the United States would defend Taiwan if it was attacked. What should the United States be doing?
So we've had this policy of strategic ambiguity for a while. And the problem that we were running into in time, and this is long before President Biden's statement, is that Taiwan would also see that as a blank check. And during the first and second terms, typically 2004, 2008 is when they would hold their elections. There were candidates who were very far leaning in terms of independence that would now be very provocative in the statements they use. And that would create now this scenario that we're trying to avoid. So messaging them going, hey, a lot of our support depends on how it starts. And if you create a scenario that now involves the Chinese, then you've created a scenario where I don't know that we can bring the American people along for that. But if it's a democracy that is innocently targeted by an invasion force, or in the case of cyber, there's already sort of attacks taking place inside of Taiwan, then that's a different story entirely.
Well, your career has moved from the Navy. Pieces of it that I wish we had another 5 hours we talk about. You led a large unit of an aerospace manufacturer, been involved in a number of different areas, including the cyber that we've talked about. But what you're doing now is fascinating.
So talk to us about Christo Rey. Talk to us, you've been involved since the beginning. Talk to us about, obviously you now lead the school, and talk to us about
So this idea originates in the south side of Chicago. Jesuit priest looks at education in the community, particularly in some of the low-income communities, and see families with no choices, and says, we have failed these families, we have failed these students because they're in a cycle they can never break out of. So he comes up with this idea, and there's a 60-minute segment that's done on it. If you were to Google 60 Minutes and Christo Rey, done in 2003 timeframe, that interviews Father Foley about his first sort of ideas. The recognition was that he was going to have a revenue-generating model because they were closing schools. They weren't opening new ones. So you had to have a model that addressed the, how are you going to make money? How are you going to keep the lights on? And so what they came up with was this unlikely partnership with the private sector. Today, that's 135 companies in Southeast Dallas, down in Pleasant Grove. At the time, it was a handful of companies, and he was convinced the first day that these 14-year-olds left school to go work in downtown Chicago, that he was going to get a phone call that said, are you out of your mind, from the CEOs? Well, the call came, and it said, do you have any more students? That's when he realized he was onto something. And the students were performing entry-level back office work. So today, we are at a school that's been open 10 years. I was part of the feasibility study in 2013 where we were examining, first of all, is there support for this idea among families that will send their students there? And is there support in the business community for this really unusual hybrid of an idea where students work? So the way we present ourselves today is we are under contract with you. It's a fee-for-service model. We take the risk, the exposure, and do the logistics. So we bring an FTE to you, a full-time equivalent. That full-time equivalent is 4 students, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. So they're rotating at your office during the month. From the student perspective, they're taking the money they earn, which for a full-time equivalent, that's $40,000, $10,000 per student. And that goes right to the cost of tuition. And that covers about 60 to 65%. So today we have students that are working at Goldman Sachs, and their favorite course, I asked the other day, advanced placement statistics. So So the audacity of what we're doing is that we are in a zip code where the median income is $33,000, where 46% of the 85,000 people who live there have a high school diploma, where less than 3% have an undergraduate degree, less than 1% with advanced degrees. 14% of school-age kids are not in school. That's the future unless we do something different. A great place for a muffler, for a hubcap, for a used tire. You won't find Trader Joe's or Starbucks. But what you get now are students that are 100% graduating and 100% have undergraduate offers, typically 8 or 9. And so they all received their undergraduate acceptance letters in February. They're graduating with a transcript that's got real advanced merit to it. And they've got a resume that shows real accomplishment in the workplace.
I want to ram this home too and just emphasize it. So high school that is in one of the lowest income areas, not of our community, but arguably of the nation. Yeah. Same students that are performing in public schools with a dropout rate significantly, fraction operating either reading or math at grade level. But yet in this school, 100% of the kids are going on to college.
495 total enrollment, 70 on a wait list. So that wait list, as interesting as it is as a word to use in Pleasant Grove, tells me that I've got more qualified need than I have resources.
So that's the progress of Christo Rey and the achievement of it. Here's the public schools. So what's the difference?
I really think there's probably a couple of things. So I had kids that were in AAU sports and was all around the city going to gyms and watching the parents go apoplectic over their kids either not getting enough playing time, ref missed a call, missed a shot, didn't get the pass. But now I understand them. And I understand them because they have no confidence in the education offered to their students because sports is the ticket out. At our school, academics is the ticket up. So we value academics and we review transcripts, we review letters of recommendation, and then we conduct interviews and we look at the motivation of the students. We means test families, meaning they have to come in with IRS documents showing how much money they make because our target is families that don't have choices. On average, it's about $45,000 a year. And just so you see the benefit of where this all goes, our doors open in 15. That group graduates in 19. That cohort graduates from college in 23. 3 of our students graduate from college early because they've learned how to manage their time. They're doing all this academic work in 4 days. So instead of 5. So I bring 2 of them and put them on our board so they can be part of this. When you look at where they're working today, civil engineer coming out of Marquette and making $100,000 a year, he's not going to be able to send his kids to our school because he makes too much money.
But you're not going to worry about his generations following.
But that's why we use the word transformational.
Yep.
So I don't want to compete against this model for donor money. I mean, because we have real metrics. We can show real outcomes. So 65% is covered by our work model. And then 35% we fundraise.
Amazing.
Well, Pat, it's been pretty obvious over the course of the last hour or so of the career that you've had, the achievements that you've had, both on the public and private sector. It's apparent that you've taken all of the things that you've been given and applied that in a way that you didn't need to when there could have been a lot of corporate opportunities out there to focus on a school that's going to make a difference for kids and the generations to follow them. I want to close with a story, though, that I think probably shows as much about you as anything. Back when you were in the Navy, you were given an assignment by the Secretary of Defense to evaluate an operation called Guantanamo. Mm-hmm. That was at the time that you were the Vice chief of naval ops, the number 2, looking to go to number 1. You looked at that, but your recommendation came out very different than the president's political statements earlier. Walk us through that.
So the run-up to the 2008 election was that Guantanamo was a stain, a moral stain, and that we needed to close it. And that became part of the president's campaign. In January of 2009, he signed an executive order that would close Guantanamo in 12 months. But part 3 of that executive order was a review for the conditions of detention to see if we were in compliance with Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. So I think the idea behind it was to determine, like, where are we right now? And it became very clear and very apparent that the Guantanamo of 2001 and 2002 was very different than the Guantanamo of 2009. There had been Supreme Court decisions. Counsel had been assigned to all the detainees. There were 246 or so. 91 were from Yemen alone. And it was pretty clear that even with all the congressional action, the presidential executive orders, that yet another report on Guantanamo, it was trying to not only answer the question, but also do it in a way that at least establishes its own place in terms of all the other reports that were done for Guantanamo. Immediately with that announcement, had all these friendly letters that came in for people offering to help, and these were the NGOs and the human rights groups that all had an opinion. I asked the Secretary of Defense staff, "What are we going to do with all those offers?" And the answer I got was pretty underwhelming. We're going to do what we always do, which is we're just going to ignore them. So I asked for something different. I said, I'd like them to respond to the question of, tell me what it is specifically, not the generalities, not the broad brush. Tell me specifically what it is that you're concerned about. And then we adopted a framework where we looked at Guantanamo from the perspective of the detainee rather than our own. So the background to having that kind of even way of asking the question had a lot to do with living in the Middle East, and one of the interesting sort of activities I was involved in the Middle East was responding to a threat of a waterborne IED on Saudi Arabia, and the real concern that terrorists would weaponize an LNG, ram it into a distribution site, and then that would, we would all be walking. It would even have worldwide impact. So we made ourselves available to the Saudis, and we worked with them and worked with local Coast Guard and navies to make sure that we were addressing their concerns. In response, months later, I got a knock on my door from the Ministry of Interior's office that wanted to show me what all the Saudis were doing as they addressed the global war on terror, because the Wahhabi group was a real problem for them. Right. And the Ministry of Interior themselves were
and the Wahhabi controlled the education system.
Yes. And so they were living with the outcome of the way that they had managed their own religion inside the Sunni religion in particular. And so at that point, I said, I'd like to kind of show you the message that we're delivering back home to the American audience. Because if I could satisfy a Saudi audience, then at least I would have, ground truth represented. So I got to slide 2, and he stopped me and he said, "Do you know what the 19 hijackers had in common?" I said, I went through the standard sort of list, and he goes, "Level of education, no. Family, no. Where the family worship, no. Family income, no. What the 19 hijackers had in common to a person is that they stopped talking to their fathers." And in Arab society, if a young man doesn't talk to his father every day, it's a sign of a problem. And if it goes on for an extended period of time, it's a sign of a real problem. So even if that was just partially true, the thought that this multi-trillion-dollar enterprise that we'd been involved in, at its root, starts at the individual level, inside the individual family, and then spreads inside the individual mosque. That was sort of a fascinating insight, and one that I didn't want to lose track of. So when I was going to Guantanamo, I thought it was really important to just ask the question, from the time they arrive until the time they're repatriated, what is it that we do? And I want it from their perspective, not ours. And so that started with hygiene. It went with showers. It went with interrogations. It went with recreation time. It went with enteral feeding. So enteral feeding was being used a lot because jihad at Guantanamo was the ultimate goal. So they wanted to die at Guantanamo, and if they could, then it could make their case. So immersing myself in this environment was really important. And what I found is that when we adopted that framework, then we could factually examine what was really going on. And then at the completion of that, we could then apply our judgment as to what are the Department of Defense guidelines for this sort of matter, whatever it is. And then what do we think of it, and what's our recommendation? As we would step through these 25 different areas, we had the approval of both the director of CIA, Panetta, to go into Camp 7, as well as Secretary Gates, Secretary of Defense, that this would be something that would be published on the internet so everybody could see. So it had to be transparent. It had to be unclassified. It had to be the sort of thing where everyone could render their own judgment, not knowing what the outcome was going to be. But that's what we had agreed to. And when we agreed to that, then conclusively what starts to happen is a pattern where accommodations were made in response to Supreme Court action or executive order or congressional action, that now Guantanamo starts to look very, very different. And it was really important to form a conclusion based on the facts rather than being drawn into something that was highly polarized. And so the conclusion ended up as being a report that is, referenced occasionally, depending on what people's agenda is. And Guantanamo is still open.
Yeah. It was a report that was done based on the facts and based on principles, not what was in the interest
of
politics or an individual's career either. And I think, Pat, that's what goes back to say an awful lot about you. I think people gotten a sense of the knowledge, the depth of the intellectual capacity. You mentioned some of the degrees you've got. You didn't mention the doctorate degree on top of it. You were the only individual that ever went from the Blue Angels to have a 4-star admiral position with the commands that are associated with that. But beyond that, you've understood a community was in need and focused on education, which, as we all know, that's the way that you change lives. Pat, thanks for everything you've done.
You bet. Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Kyle.